Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. At the break of the new year, North Korea held its first party congress in 5 years. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who had admitted earlier the failure of his economic policy, called the United States the biggest enemy. He continued on emphasizing the need to develop a strategic nuclear weapon and to produce a supersized warhead. He also added that North Korea will take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth approach towards the U.S. Kim Jong-un's statement on the U.S. came out a little after the U.S. Congress finalized the victory of President-elect Joe Biden. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining us is David Maxwell, his senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He is director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. As expected, Kim Jong-un made the remarks about the U.S., but his stance seems to be rather firm. He called the U.S. the biggest enemy. What do you make of this, Mr. Maxwell?
He is really reverting to a hardline policy. I think that, the initial statements from the Eighth Party Congress, focused on the economy, focused on admitting the failures, but he really seems to have concluded that the United States is the major enemy, that he is going to continue the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and I think that he's really trying to say that he wants to negotiate from an equal footing as a nuclear power, and which really tells me that he has really no intention of denuclearization, but he may want to enter into some kind of arms control negotiations, but again on an equal footing, just like the United States and the USSR did during the Cold War when they negotiated SALT and START nuclear agreements. But I think he's really maintaining a hard line. His political warfare strategy that's really based on blackmail diplomacy, which is increased tensions, threats, and provocations to gain political and economic concessions. And in the end, I think when we look at the entire total of the Eighth Party Congress, his near-term objective will remain sanctions relief. And I think that's one of the key messages and objectives that he's going to be focused on after the inauguration of the new Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think that Dave's reading of Kim Jong-un's intentions behind his statement is basically correct. What really catches my eye is the apparent willingness to use continued development of his military capabilities, and the fact that those abilities have not been capped as potential leverage and as a way of redirecting the focal point, as Dave said, towards an arms control approach versus denuclearization. And I think it'll be very interesting and actually tough for the Biden administration to respond to that framing.
Mm-hmm. He said North Korea will move on to developing the supersized warhead and on to improving the accuracy rate of 15,000 kilometer range missiles. How did you take this, Mr. Snyder?
Well, it's not what we want to hear. It's bad news. I think that Kim Jong-un wants to establish mutual deterrence, and I think that he wants to use his capabilities as leverage to draw the U.S. Into a different kind of relationship. He really is trying to, I think, establish mutual deterrence. But Dave mentioned the U.S.-Soviet context. What we also need to see from the North Korean leadership is evidence and commitment to self-restraint.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, this remark was clearly aiming at the United States, wasn't it?
Yes, certainly the 15,000 kilometer range is certainly to range the United States. And to follow up on Scott's point about self-restraint, he did apparently make a comment that they want nuclear weapons, but they will refrain from using them as long as they are not targeted. So that's kind of a message there that that they will negotiate, and he's trying to demonstrate, I think, that they will be a responsible nuclear power, which, of course, I think is not true. The other thing I think it's important is that since he closed with this focus on the military, focused on nuclear development, focused on the United States as a threat, it's clear that despite all the economic problems, that he's going to continue to prioritize his resources to developing nuclear weapons and military capabilities, which is going to be at the expense of the welfare of the Korean people in the North. They will continue to suffer, and they will not get economic relief as he continues to pursue this path of nuclear development. I think that Kim Jong-un's only hope and his course of action is that because of these threats, that the United States and South Korea will give concessions and sanctions relief, which is probably the only way that will help his economy. But the fact is, his decision, this policy decision, will cause the Korean people in the North to continue to suffer.
And Kim Jong-un also hailed the completion of a research design for a nuclear submarine. Shall we take this statement at face value, Mr. Maxwell?
Yes. Well, I think, he has developed a submarine-launched ballistic missile capability initially. He hasn't demonstrated an actual launch capability, but he's clearly pursuing that. And I think this really illustrates his nuclear intention, which is to develop a dual nuclear capability, to have what we call a second strike capability. And this is really to enhance deterrence. As Scott said, he really wants to develop a deterrent capability. And so with ground missile launch capability and a submarine launched ballistic missile capability, he has two ways to conduct a nuclear attack. And the submarine launched ballistic missile is theoretically more survivable and provides a second strike should he launch an initial strike, which of course we would respond to.
Mr. Snyder, what is your view on this?
Yeah, I think that the submarine-launched ballistic missile references remind me a lot of the statements that Kim Jong-un made about developing long-range missiles at the beginning of 2017. It is a focal point, I think, for their efforts, and I think that it may be an area where we see more activity to come, but it's still very much, I think, in process. And so the fact that he's highlighting this, I think, shows that it remains an area that he'd like to develop, a capability that he'd like to have, precisely because it gives more flexibility in terms of strike options and survivability.
And here's another statement from Kim Jong-un about the United States. He said, no matter who is in the power in the United States, the true nature of the U.S. and the real intentions of the U.S. policy towards North Korea will never change. And he stressed that North Korea will take strong for strong and good for good stance towards the U.S., which means he will go tit for tat towards the United States. This remark, of course, came just after the U.S. Congress certified Biden's election. Was Kim Jong-un waiting for the certification, Mr. Snyder?
No, I don't think that he was waiting for the certification. I think this is a function of the timing of the Eighth Party Congress. And really, I think that the statements regarding a tit-for-tat approach by North Korea are consistent with the statements that came out of party meetings at the end of 2019 and that framed 2020. And so the challenge is that we really do not see any evidence of softening by North Korea in advance of the Biden administration. And I think that it bodes for a very difficult time in terms of getting a negotiation on track.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, does Kim Jong-un mean that he will not go easy?
I don't think he intends to go easy at all. And I think this statement and these hardline statements, and especially the statement about the hostile policy continuing, it actually may be a challenge to the Biden administration. It actually may be saying that, Biden is just like Trump. And it may be an intent to try to get the Biden administration to change policy. But he is going to approach any negotiations and any kind of relationship with the United States from his perceived position of strength. And that, of course, rests on their nuclear capability. And so he is laying down a hard line from which to negotiate. But I think he would like to see Biden make concessions. And again, this, I think, is typical blackmail diplomacy, where he is trying to drive political and economic concessions based on the threats and his hard line and his belief that Biden will want to reduce tensions. And the way to reduce tensions will be to give concessions to North Korea. And I would just say that Kim Jong-un could not be more wrong to believe that President-elect Biden will give in to this kind of blackmail diplomacy.
And of course, the inter-Korean relationship was one of the topics. Kim said the inter-Korean relations moved backward to before the 2018 Panmunjom Declaration. He even said that South Korea turned away from North Korea's demand to stop the U.S.-ROK joint military exercises. Mr. Maxwell, how would you interpret this?
Well, I think it's quite disingenuous. South Korea has been very responsible in executing the comprehensive military agreement from September 2018 in very good faith. And it is North Korea that has not reciprocated. And the very little that they have done, removal of some guard posts and changing status in the joint security area, really has done nothing to reduce tensions in a significant way. And of course, we should keep in mind that North Korea continues to train, and they are training right now in their winter training cycle, which is, of course, designed to bring the North Korean military forces to the highest state of readiness. We have scaled back, postponed, and even canceled exercises to support diplomacy, to reduce tensions, and this has not resulted in any kind of positive response from North Korea. So it is imperative that the ROK-US military alliance continues to train. All militaries must train, and for us to not train and not conduct our exercises would put South Korea at great risk because North Korea continues to be a conventional and nuclear threat against South Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, how did you see this Kim Jong-un's assessment of inter-Korean relations?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un's statements reveal more clearly than just about any other statements that he has made the level of distrust that North Korea feels towards South Korea. And at the same time that it demonstrated that level of distrust, Kim Jong-un also made an appeal to South Korea to show trust in North Korea, essentially by choosing not to deter and choosing not to continue to advance its own military development. And so I think that Kim Jong-un's statements represent a very effective, potentially, effort to drive a wedge both within South Korean society on the issue of how much can we trust North Korea and to drive a wedge between the U.S. and South Korea.
Mm-hmm. Kim continued on with his discontent towards South Korea. He said North Korea will no longer show one-sided goodwill towards South Korea and will only respond proportionately to what South Korea does. Mr. Snyder, what is Kim Jong-un demanding here?
Well, essentially, he's demanding that that efforts toward reconciliation not be accompanied by deterrence. But that is contrary to the basics of confidence building in a relationship and essentially represents a request for a set of concessions that would amount to surrender. And so it's really not a basis upon which to pursue a stable inter-Korean relationship. In fact, I think that it is a bad omen for the prospects for a stable or improved inter-Korean relationship going forward.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Maxwell?
Well, I think this illustrates that Kim Jong-un is not a responsible member of the international community. I echo what Scott said. The stance towards South Korea is, again, really disingenuous. they said that one-sided, efforts towards South Korea. Well, South Korea has been making the one-sided efforts, the good faith efforts to engage, and North Korea has rebuffed them at every stage. And so it is really North Korea that is the problem, not South Korea. And I think that another general comment is Kim Jong-un clearly is mirror imaging and is projecting, his actions on South Korea and on the United States. And so I think that he is really showing us just how irresponsible he is, just how naive he is, and just how little that he knows how to conduct international affairs. And I think that's one of his major weaknesses.
And until these remarks were made public, Kim Jong-un seemed to have been focused on the economic hardship in the country. He admitted that his economic development plans have failed. How will he overcome this when the international sanctions are still in place? Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think that these remarks on defense capabilities really underscore the fallacy that Kim Jong-un has accepted that the nuclear capability is essential in order to create a peaceful environment for economic development, when in fact the nuclear capability is the primary obstacle to North Korea's ability to pursue economic development. And so for me, what this signals is that inside, in the internal North Korean economy, Kim Jong-un is prescribing a course which essentially means that the North Korean people are going to have to roll the boulder back up the hill again, but they're not likely to make it to the top.
Mr. Maxwell, do you agree with what Mr. Snyder said?
Absolutely. And I think that, especially the point about the nuclear program as an obstacle, it is not to North Korea's benefit. And I think this, again, reinforces that the people are going to have to suffer so that Kim Jong-un can continue to pursue nuclear weapons. And it is really a bankrupt course of action to believe that by demonstrating nuclear power and military strength, that he is going to get the United States, South Korea, and the international community to acquiesce to his demands. So basically, his economic policies are really based on coercing the international community to lift sanctions. He really has no economic plan, and his message to the Korean people in the North is improve your ideological training, trust the party, and support Kim Jong-un's nuclear development and Songun, military first politics.
Now, Kim Jong-un has clearly sent a message to the United States. He said that the key to the North Korea-US relationship is the US abandoning its hostile policies. Now, the United States is very busy preparing for the power transition. When do you expect to see the overall picture of the Biden team's North Korean policy, Mr. Maxwell?
Well, I think it will be some time because the United States will be focused on COVID and our economic situation. But I think it's important to remember how Kim Jong-un defines the hostile policy and what an end to the hostile policy is, and what he really demands from the United States, which is really an end to the ROK-US alliance, removal of US troops from the Korean Peninsula, an end to the extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. And these are really unacceptable conditions. But that is the hostile policy and the physical actions that he really demands. He is not interested in verbal agreements, in written statements, of security guarantees. He really wants to split the ROK-US alliance and really remove US troops from the Korean Peninsula. And this is, a key part of his strategy to do that. And so the demand for the hostile policy is really one that is unacceptable to South Korea and the United States.
Mr. Snyder, shall we wait longer to see Biden's North Korean policies?
Yeah, it's going to take some time, but I think that the North Korean framing of the approach coming out of the Eighth Party Congress is actually going to make the situation more difficult for the Biden administration in the initial phases. Of course, the South Korean government is going to want assurances that the Biden administration is going to want to engage. But the terms of engagement, I think, are going to be influenced by this approach. And actually, Kim Jong-un has left very precious little room for the Biden administration to frame a mutually cooperative approach to negotiations because of its exclusion of the possibility of denuclearization. Yet at the same time, I do think that it will be important for both the United States and North Korea to establish a reliable channel for crisis communication in order to be able to manage and avert the worst possible scenarios related to miscalculation.
Well, with a little more than 10 days before President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration, the whole world's eyes are fixed on the United States, and many are very keen to find out when and how the Biden administration will lay out its North Korean policies. Mr. Maxwell and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.